Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's webinar. This week, or this month, I'll say, we are going to take a look at creating stylized materials here in Substance Designer. So I'll be monitoring the chat as we go through, so if you have any questions, just let me know, and of course, we'll try to have some time for some Q&A afterwards. Also, I've gone ahead and pasted a link to download the substance that we're going to be covering here today. So just to be sure, if you could hear me okay, just give me a quick thumbs up in the live chat, and then we'll get started. Okay, looks like we're good to go. So let's just jump right in and get started. So what we're going to do is take a look at just creating this stylized stone material that you see here. And so the process of creating a stylized material is no different than any other material you're going to create. So the idea here with all the substance tools is that we are always working with physically based materials. And so a lot of times we get questions from new users saying, well, I want to create a stylized asset. Do I need to have, do I need PBR? What isn't that for realistic assets? And the answer to that is no, definitely it's not just for realistic assets. PBR, if you look at a really good example I like to always give, if you look at Disney's principled shader that they develop, which pretty much all PBR is based off of, that's designed being principled, meaning that, it doesn't have to be like, 100% realistically accurate. There is tons and tons of room for artistic interpretation in how these materials are created. The core idea of the materials behaving in a physical or plausible way is always going to be valid, and in my opinion, it's always going to be the best way to work. You get all the benefits of PBR, consistent workflow, it's going to look accurate or correct in all lighting situations, and so on. So you're going to have those aspects. But again, like we said, it's principled, meaning that there's lots of room for artistic interpretation on how we're going to create that. So that's where we're going to start here. And you'll see that, again, like I said, we're going to follow along with our same PBR workflows and concepts, but we're going to, just do things slightly different when it comes to giving it more of a stylized type look. All right, so the first thing I'm going to start here is just with my base material. So you'll hear me say this a lot. Hopefully it's not a broken record, but I always start here with my base material when I create any type of material. The workflow is going to be metallic roughness, and for our preset, I'm just going to set this to dielectric since, we're not working with any metals here. And then I'll kind of set myself a roughness value. So once I have this, right-click, drag and drop right here into my view, and now I've got this nice modeling material to kind of work from. So another thing that I think really starts, when you're looking at realistic assets, stylized assets, lighting plays a huge role in this, of course. So again, let me just go back here to my material that we're going to be working on. Let me just talk about a small bit about the lighting. So here in Designer, we're always going to be using the HDR maps you find here in your 3D view or any types of environments that you bring in yourself. And so basically, we're going to be lighting this with some type of HDR. Here in Designer, we don't have the directional lights that you're going to have inside of an engine. However, it's important to kind of look at your lighting in a sense that is it going to give you the type of color palette or the type of contrast that you want. So in my case, what I did was I started with this small apartment, and I did that because the small apartment, if we kind of look at it here, you can see that it has two different types of lighting sources. We have this kind of incandescent yellow light that's overhead that's giving us kind of like a warm, and then in contrast right here in the back, and then here, it's probably hard to see in the stream, but if you look at the view, you'll be able to see that we've got this window, which is going to give us this kind of really cool blue. And so here in the environment, as I start to move this around, we start to get this kind of lighting contrast. We've got warms contrasting with these cool tones together, kind of brings up this kind of stylized look, and it helps to illustrate that. So you'll see that you get a bit of a difference. Like if I use like, well, it works fine in this lighting as well, but let's try something like glazed patio. Still, it works. It's not bad, but you can see that, the lighting does give you a bit of a different feel for this. So again, if you're working in a stylized type environment, I think it's important to not disregard the whole lighting scheme that you're going to have, because it's very, very important. So again, something to kind of illustrate. And that's why I'm starting here with this small apartment, because again, it just gives me more of a stylized kind of look here to my lights. All right, so with that said, let me just go back here to this material, and I'll just place this here into the cube. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is just, as I always do, I'm going to start working on my height information that I'm then going to extrapolate into my normal and my roughness and so on. And so one of the first things I'm going to do is just start here with, my tile generator to create some stones. So what we're going to end up using here is this node, which is going to be our tile generator. And I'm just using the basic tile generator. And so here you can see for my parameters, number X is 3, Y is, number Y is 4. And let me just see if there's anything particular that I set with this. Not really. A little bit of variation here in the intersize. And then scrolling down, I don't think I did anything too different. No, that's it. So the main thing that I'm using with this node here is that I'm changing my pattern type. So of course we have several patterns, but I wanted to set more of a specific pattern type. So what I did was I started here with my shape, and I blurred it to get a bit of these round edges like this, and then I ran a levels here to really kind of sharpen that round edge. So it's basically like a chamfer on the edge. So now I've got this shape, which is then running into my tile generator, and as you can see, like I said, we're using that pattern set to input. So this is our shape. Now it's being run here into our tile pattern. So this is what I have. And now what we can do with this, though, is doing things like maybe adjusting this bevel, this blur intensity now gives us a control to kind of change the separation values between these two guys. So I kind of set it fairly high, close to 10, so that I could get a really kind of close separation between these bricks, and you can see how this rounded edge is working for us. So that's our tile generator part. So right now, again, not so worried about the 3D view, just really focusing on these really, really basic shapes. So then I just run it here through a bevels node. And so on the bevels, I am increasing my smoothing, and I put my corner type here to round. So here, this is just kind of giving me a little bit of a bevel edge. Okay, so now that we kind of have some shape happening, what I like to do is start to visualize this here in my 3D view. So of course, what I'll do is grab hold of my normal node, and I'm going to take my height output and just feed that in. Now, you may be asking, okay, well, you have normal on here. Why don't you just use this? And I very well could. I think that a lot of times I'm just so used to not doing that, that, I just grab an extra normal node here. It really doesn't matter. So here on this normal node, you can see that if we select it, we do have a normal intensity, and we do have the ability to change the format. Here on this node, I have my intensity and my normal format, which is really what I'm going to be working with. So it just depends on how you want to do it. Here, just for argument's sake, let's just do it this way. Let's just borrow it right off this node since it's already there. One less node to have to compute less here in our graph, which is always good. All right, so come down here to our user-defined maps. We'll enable our normal map channel, and then let's just do this connection here. So now you can see right here in our 3D view, we're already starting to see, the result here of our normal here. And of course, we can go back and start to change this normal intensity if we need to. So maybe what I'll do in this case is just set this guy here to 20 for now. All right, so here's our brick. Or our stone, and we have something happening here. And then, like I said, I love to use this this base material node, because now I've got controls for coming in and interactively changing my roughness if I need to, as you can see here, and then changing the color and so on. So this serves as like my modeling material as I work. All right, so we'll just move this guy on over this way. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to start to kind of rough up these edges, and that's where I start to introduce my slope blurs. So let's take a look at the way I kind of have this structured. And by doing this, I kind of came up with a workflow that I like, that I found that I started using on other materials as well. So I want to share that with you. So like I said, I start with a slope blur. And here I'm going to have this Perlin noise. So it's just part of the noises that ship with Designer. And I like this Perlin noise zoom because it gives me this distance slider here, so we can, change the scale basically. So right now with the distance set to this value, and I slope blur this with the min setting, you can see I'm getting some large kind of cuts into these shapes. And this slope blur tool, and I apologize if I sound like a broken record when I keep saying things, but for those who may not have heard this before, I love this slope blur tool because it acts like a planing tool. So I always like to think about this in terms of like modeling and in using like, say, a ZBrush workflow where, for example, here in our 3D view, we have our basic kind of shape. And then what I would do maybe inside of ZBrush is I would go and use my trim dynamic brush to start kind of, cutting into the shape to start creating planes, all kinds of different nice planes and angles where light can hit and catch. And so this slope blur, when you set this to min, it's doing pretty much the same kind of thing. You can see that we used to have a really clean edge here, and then we slope blur it. I'm sorry, we had a clean edge here. We slope blur it with this kind of noise, and you can see this noise is now kind of cutting in. So we're using this noise as kind of like a triplanar type projection or a process, I'll say, onto the shape. And so with the zoom set to this value that we have, you can see it's giving me some large type shapes. And I really like how we're getting like these nice hard edges like this. Really good for things like stones and, and kind of more natural thing, or not natural, but brick, stones, that kind of stuff. Okay, so this is like the first stage of this. So then what I do is I use a Perlin noise zoom again. This time you can see that I've really increased the distance, meaning that increasing the value is kind of like zooming it out, basically. So just think about this distance. The higher you go, the further you zoom out on the noise. And then I do a slope blur on this guy again. So now you can see with a higher distance, if we look at the thumbnail, we now get smaller kind of cut-in shapes. So now I've got these two variations. I've got large and small. So once I have these two guys together, what I like to do then is blend them with an add mode. And so this produces this kind of edge result that you see here. So it's a mix of, these larger shapes and the smaller shapes. And I kind of really like what this is kind of doing for me here on these edges. And of course, if I want to change this, I can always come in and start to adjust my intensity. So you can see here, just a small intensity value just changes how much of these smaller type, cuts are doing. Or I can come back here to the large and just cut into this a little bit more here with the large. So you get, flexibility of being able to go back and tweaking these settings here. So maybe I'll try something like this here. So now I've got kind of my edge damage, which is working for me pretty well. All right, so now that we have that, let's visualize what we have so far. So here is where we get into that situation where I should have just had my normal node, because you can see I borrowed it from here and it worked great in that situation, but now I do need to create a normal node. So now we'll just do this, and we'll set this, as you recall, we had an intensity of 20, so we'll pull this guy into here, and then boom, add this normal into our base. So now here in our 3D view, here's what we're getting. And you can see that, it already looks a bit stylized, a bit more kind of like a cartoon type feel, which is kind of what we're going for. So that's good. One of the key that I'll say pretty early on when I think about stylized assets is that, like I said, we're still working in the realms of physically based, as you can see here with our base material node. We're still talking about, our roughness, our albedo values, and all those kind of things. However, when it comes to the details, it's like we're trying to, I like to say I'm trying to capture like more of like the essence of what the shape is instead of this realistic, like very microscopic view of what the surface is. So instead of having like all these intricate cracks and details and all this kind of stuff, I'm really just trying to give a hint of it. So that okay, this is stone, we can see it's damaged. But as you can see, this is as far as I'm going to go when it comes to detail on this. So it's a a lot more simple to create these types of assets, I think. All right, so there is where we are at this stage. Now, the next thing I do is I have another tile generator here. And actually, I will come back to that guy in just a moment because I'm going to tell you why I'm using that. So we'll come back to this guy in a moment. So for now, let's take a look. You can see that here, when we did this add mode, we get some really nice edges, but it really just flat planed this whole entire top piece of the stone. So it's completely white, really flat piece. So now we need to start to add some kind of more of beveled details into here. So to do that, what I do is I start to create a noise that looks like this. So to do that, I start with cells 1, which is just, again, another kind of stock noise that we ship with over here in Designer. Then I invert it to get this kind of webbing type look, I guess. And then here again, you can see I'm slope blurring it just to get a little bit of these kind of lines and edges into here. So it kind of, warps the line a little bit. So here you can see just how straight and clean this is. So I'm warping it slightly, adding a little bit of extra variation to some lines in here, and I'm slope blurring it with, again, this time I'm just borrowing back my original or one of these procedural Perlin noise zooms. So I'm just borrowing that guy again. One of the things that you kind of want to do when it comes to creating your materials is if you can reuse a node, try to do it as often as you can. Again, just less nodes to compute in the graph. So that's why I chose to do that. Sometimes you can't do it because you want to use a different value, so that's why here you can see I've got 2 instances of that node. All right, so here's what we have. Then I'm going to do a directional warp on this guy. Okay, now, wait, I'm sorry. Before I do that, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's do this. All right, let's take what we have here, and I'm going to integrate this noise on top. So what I'll do here is I'll use a blend, and I'll plug this guy here into the foreground, and then we'll take our brick shape so far, and we'll plug that into the background. And then for the blending mode, we're going to set it to multiply. And so we'll view this here in our background. So now that we have that set to multiply, you can see that I can start to adjust this opacity value here. So again, we're looking at the height. This is what we're working on. So now we're starting to get some value, some slope value. So here at these white lines are going to be like the peak. And then you can see we get a nice little transitional slope downwards as it kind of just goes more towards flat in the height with this gray. So now let's take this and plug it into our normal. And we'll look at it over here on our 3D view. And you can see that now we're starting to get something that looks a little bit more like this stone. And we can adjust the kind of the level of this through our height. So the more I increase it, kind of the more dramatic this is going to look. So maybe I'll try just like a 0.8 here. All right, so that's kind of where we are at this stage. Now, here you'll see that I'm using this directional warp. So here's where this guy comes into play. Now, I'll say that, lately when I've been working on stone materials, I've been using this same technique. I've really kind of been liking this a lot, except the difference being if I'm trying to make something a little bit more realistic, there's going to be many more variation levels to this. So right now, this is pretty much as detailed as I'm going to go with this stylized look. But of course, if this was wanting this to be more realistic, we just layer and layer more noises onto that. Okay, so if you look at this noise that we layered or we multiplied on top here, you can see that we've got this line on this brick and it just follows right along with this guy and it follows, so it's basically, it's just like a copy and paste, this image right over top of this one, and here's what we have. So it's not randomized in any way like it would be. So the trick to fixing that is to use a directional warp. And so what you do is you take your pattern and then you directionally warp it by some type of intensity value. And so that is why I have this other tile generator. So here you'll notice that, let's see here. All I did was I took this tile generator and I just copy and pasted it and just used the same level input coming into it here. And then way down here towards the bottom, you'll notice, let's see, maybe it's not at the bottom. Where is this guy? I always forget where this is. It's kind of a mess when you look at these controls. There it is. Luminance, variation, and contrast. And then we can change this value here to add some just variance to the luminance range. So instead of it just being all white, you can see that we've got white, little gray, darker gray, and so on. It's just kind of randomly varied here. And so when you have this, we can think of this as just different intensities, where white being, a very high intensity and kind of this darker gray being a lower intensity. And if we want to even make this even more dramatic, we can start to try to increase this contrast. So now you can see that, we can just kind of tweak this a little bit. So maybe I'll try something more like this. So now we get even more variation to that. So now when I feed this intensity value here into this directional warp, so here, if we just do it with an intensity of 0, as I start to move this intensity value, you can see that what it does is just warping based on that intensity, so it just breaks these lines up. And this is a really great technique when you're doing things like stones and bricks and so on, and you need to make it look like each stone is its own separate stone, like it would be in the real world. And then we can also change this warp angle to tweak it as well. So maybe I'll try something like this here. Okay, so like I said, this just kind of warps everything. And then we're going to feed this back here into this blend. So this is that original blend that I had. So let me go back and just adjust my opacity to get something like this. So now, here's what we had, something that was uniform, and now we've made it non-uniform with that directional warp, and we'll plug that into our normal. And here's the new look that we have, which I think is a lot better. So here in my view, if I just kind of move my light around, we can see, how that normal how the normal is affecting the lighting in terms of shading, and we can see, what these nice planes are looking like now. All right, so there we are at that stage. Now, something else I want to mention here, which I think is pretty cool. So you'll notice that I had this tile generator. And then I had to make a duplicate of this tile generator. So, I talked to the team internally about this. And so I was wondering, hey, is there a way that I can do this, without having to do an extra tile generator? And so, thankfully, the wizards at Algorithmic, the Substance Designer devs, have created a new node to do that. Now, I don't have it yet; it's not in this build, but it's something that will show up eventually in an update to Designer. But we're going to have a new feature that allows you to take, when you just have a node or an output like this, and then being able to do some random variation like this. So the reason why it works with this tile generator is if you were to go into this tile generator, so you can just right click any node and say open reference. Here, we'll do it real quick so we can see it. You can see that it's actually being built on an effects map. And so with an effects map, each one of these kind of square shapes is basically an iteration of its own entity. So that allows us to be able to do things like vary those illuminance ranges, because each one of these shapes is like a slice, like a sliced off piece that we can manipulate individually. And so that's why you can do that there with an FX map. But once it's like output, like you see here, it's almost like, say, in Photoshop, where you have a bunch of layers and you do merge the PSD down. So you've kind of merged everything down. Now each one of these shapes, we can't affect them individually. So I can't think of a good way to randomize each one of these shapes like this. But thankfully, we will have a tool to do that. So I just wanted to share that tip with you guys. It's coming, hopefully soon. All right, so that's, again, why we have this extra tile generator. All right, so here we'll delete that guy. We don't need him anymore. And we've covered all these nodes here. And now we're at this stage. So this is basically finishes, well, no, I think I did a little bit more. Let's see. Yeah, I think I did. All right, let's see, what else do I have here? Oh, yeah, I did some cracks. All right, there is the cracks. Let me go to that in just a moment. And let me see. Okay, so the next thing I kind of wanted to do with this is I wanted to add just a couple little small kind of holes and chipped in pieces. So like I said, I want to be careful. I don't want to get too crazy with it. So what I did was I used this Dirt 3 noise because it has these little speckles here, and then I ran a levels on it to really pull these guys out. So this is what I'm looking for, little shapes like this. And then I blurred it slightly here. And then I want to start to kind of mask these off, because right now that's just a lot of little shapes. And so I use something like a Perlin noise, ran a levels on it just as the mask. Well, it's going to act as a mask here. And then you can see that I'm just multiplying this shape with these little kind of dots, and then it just kind of masks them out based on this foreground element here. So that's why we have that multiply. And then you'll see that I took something like a grunge map here that has the contrast brought up pretty high. And then we do the same thing here. We multiply again. Hopefully you can see that here in the stream. It's kind of dark. Looks like it's okay in the browser when I check it. So now we've just get a small couple little bits here and there. And so now we'll just take this and subtract it down into here, into our regular shapes that we've had. So let's throw this here into our normal so we can see what we have. All right, now here in the 3D view, what this is doing is just adding a couple, little imperfections here to our wall, to our stones here. Nothing too crazy, just a couple little, just a little variation. But like I said, we're not going super deep with it, just a little bit. All right, so that takes care of kind of this whole area like this. So the next part of this stage is we want to start to look at the cracks. And again, I like to point out, this whole time I'm just doing everything here on height. So like I always say, if you nail the height, if you can get a really fantastic height that looks awesome here, then you know your material is going to work. Because, the height, once you get the height and the normal, everything else can just fall right into place from that. Okay, so here's how I start to kind of do the cracks. So basically, I want to try to come up with a pattern like this. And so to get this pattern, what I do is I just use a tile random node with the pattern set to disk, and then just tweaking a few of these settings here. Like we've got the size random on the X and Y, and some scale is set here with some random scale values, rotation random, so we're randomly rotating each individual piece here, some offset rotation, position is randomized as well. And then finally here we've got our colorize random, and that's very important. So we need some of these shapes to be white, and we need some to kind of fade off in the background, almost like we're creating like a Z-depth pass or something. So then we can run that through the distance node, and you'll see here that I have a little levels. In case you didn't know, you can dock these nodes. So here I've got a levels to create a mask. You can see I just took the input white and just pulled it all the way towards the black to take this range and just mask it off. And that's going to go into our mask input of our distance node. And then we have our source input, which is our tile. And then just you can see here as I start to just pull in this distance, it basically kind of pushes all these shapes to each other to create this pattern here. This is like a Veroni pattern. Okay, so once you have that, then you can use your edge detect node to get this shape. Now, of course, yes, we do have a shape like this already. So if we go into here, I think it's like cells 3, something like this. So here's cells 3. You can see we've got something like this. Now, you might be asking, well, why didn't you just use that? Well, the reason is because now I've got control over everything. So like if I go into my edge detect now, if I want to thicken this up, I can just do my edge width. I can actually introduce some edge roundness into this. I can invert it if I needed to, and so on. Also, if I come back to this tile random here, let's view the edge detect and then single click on the tile random. And you can see that if I start to just change like my X, I can change this pattern up. Whereas with this cell here, I can do my distance basically, and I can change my disorder, but that's about all I can do. And you can see here that the lines are pretty thin as well, so I'd have to try to come up a way to thicken these lines anyways. So sometimes it's kind of nice to kind of just homegrown these lines here, and this is going to give me this shape. And so here you can see that I'm gonna do a little trick here where I'm going to just blur both of these lines here. So let's do the first one. So I blur the lines to kind of thicken them a little bit, and then I warp it by each other. Here. So actually, I think this was me just kind of playing around. So let me do this. Let's do this blur here. What do I have here? Multiply. Let's see. I don't even know if I need that warp in here. So I'm just kind of checking what I did. Probably can make this a lot easier. Let's do this. Yeah, I think this is better. Let's forget this warp piece out of here. I don't know what I was doing there. All right, so we got an edge detect, and then, like I said, we blur, and then I'm just going to take the blur and then just multiply it back over itself. And then, so that kind of thickens the line up. So here's what we had. It was really thin, very aliased. So we're using the blur to kind of anti-alias it and then, you know, multiply it by itself. And now we get more of a thickened line here that we can control now with our blur. So I should be able to, you know, thicken this up a little bit. So something like this. All right. So it just kind of cleans the line up. And then I warped the line here with just a Perlin noise zoom. So very subtle, just a little bending of the lines here. And then what we're going to do is run it through a slope blur with a Perlin noise zoom, slope blur, always set to min, rarely use any other mode with slope blur. And that's going to create kind of these crack lines here for me, these cracked edges. Okay, and then let's see here. Ha, you know what? That's funny. I actually ended up using this. Oh, so weird. Okay. Sorry about this, guys. That was another thing that it looks like I tried to do. Like I just went through this whole explanation of why am I not doing this, and then I ended up using this. Anyways, here, let's jump into it though and take a look. Because I can show you a good reasoning behind this. All right, so long story short, we've got this shape that I created manually, and then in the end, I ended up just using this shape. I think because it was just giving me a finer set, but I think I'm going to change it back. So let's do this. You can see that I'm doing the same thing to create my lines here with the slope blur. I really don't like it, so let's do this. Let's just get rid of this guy. So let's get rid of this guy, and let's see here. We're going to have our lines into the here. Now, we want to be able to do the same thing. We're going to break these lines up. So before we do this directional blur, let me just plug this into here. Okay. All right. I'm just kind of building this back little by little just so it makes sense. So let me do it like this, just so we can see it stage by stage. All right, so we've got our blend. All right, here's where we left off. This was our shape that we're currently viewing here in our 3D view. And then we got this blend here, which is going to be these cracks that we made. So let's just take this, this shape that we have, our original height, and plug that into the background. And then let's place a multiply into here. And now we can adjust our opacity for our cracks. So let's do this, and then let's integrate this here into our normal map so we can see it here in our 3D view. All right, so this looks, I think these crack lines I have look better. I'm sorry, I really don't know what I was doing with that small cell, this guy here. So, whoops, let me just find it. I don't know why I had that in there, so let's just disregard that. Okay, so here we've got our shape, right? And we've got these cracks, and they're not very detailed, which is precisely what we need. They get the point across. They give us that kind of essence or feel of cracks, but they're not like really, really like varied, and they don't have a lot of noise and all that kind of stuff. So that's precisely the kind of path we want to go down, so to speak. All right, so we have this in place. And like I said, we're multiplying, and we can adjust the depth of these cracks or the strength of these cracks just by changing our opacity. And you can see here we're probably going to end up using something pretty low. Now, there's one of the things is there's a lot of cracks on here, right? So a couple things that we could do. We could come over into what I'm doing here is, let's see, instead of using this crack, what I kind of wanted to do was randomly just remove some of them. So I started with the idea of taking like a Perlin noise and running a levels on it to create a mask. So this is my foreground input. My background is just the original cracks that we did, and then I did an add to kind of, you know, thin out some of these and remove some of the lines. And then we could even play around with this here too by just moving our distance, I think. So do something. Yeah, so just kind of vary some of these lines and stuff. And maybe even just, yeah, there we go. So now you can see that as I start to move this levels effect here as well, I'm kind of diminishing or removing some of these cracks. So let's take this guy. So So instead of using this one that has all of the cracks in place, let's use the ones that's been processed here against this noise. So we'll plug this in. And now you can see this looks even better because now we've got some damage like on here, then it kind of disappears, and then we've got some here. So now it's just a bit more varied and not as uniform as it was before. So that's good. Okay, now another thing that we want to do before we integrate this guy down into here, because like I said, what we're doing at this stage is we're just multiplying this down into it. So typically what I like to do is mix it up here with this directional warp. So here you can see I'm just using that luminance varied, copy of that tile generator. And we'll plug that here into the input. And you can see that now I can just offset these cracks like this. You can see it's just offsetting them for each one of those luminance values. And then let's put this guy here into the play. And now it offsets them again. So here, if I come back to this directional warp, you can see that I can start to just change how these cracks, I can actually just kind of place them right here. So maybe I'll do something like this. Okay, there we go. I really like how this one kind of worked out for me. So cool. All right, so now we've gone this far. Let's grab all of these guys and just move them away for now. All right. So at this stage of the game, we have our entire height map here. There it is. Sorry, I wasn't viewing it in my 2D view. So at this stage of the game, like I said, we've got our entire height map. And this is when everything has been done based on grayscale values. Okay, so everything is grayscale at this stage. So we'll do this. Now, the next thing I want to do here is when I go through the map extraction phase. Now, we've already done that here with our height. I'm sorry, our normal map. So we've already got our normal map. So the next thing we want to do is we want to start looking at things like ambient occlusion and roughness and so on. And so you can see where I started to kind of work through this here. So let me just compute these thumbnails. There we go. And I'm just going to take a look at some of these things that I did here. Okay, I'll tell you what, let's do it this way. All right, so I'm just going to kind of freestyle this a bit. So what I want to do now is I have, my basic... I have my basic normal map in place, and here's when I want to start thinking about my ambient occlusion and my roughness. Now, the roughness depends. Okay, so one of the things that roughness does that's so important, I think it's the most important map that you can create. The more detailed and the more specific your roughness map is, the more realistic things are going to look. So for something like maybe this stylized asset, we really probably only need something that's pretty uniform. So like in this case, what we could do is maybe even get away, depending on how stylized you want to go, just using this uniform random value. Okay, so like here, we could maybe get away with it like this. So, but what I'm going to do is and I think that's what I did here, because I don't even see where I have, yeah, if you look, my roughness, I just did a uniform map. So I think I want to change that up a little bit. So what I'm going to do here is just give you some ideas on how to do roughness. A couple different ways. So one thing that I do, now this is when I'm working on surfaces that are going to be like, really realistic. Sometimes I'll take like my height map, and you can see I've generated my normal. Since the normal is describing so much of the surface attribute, I try to kind of maybe pull that off of the, I try to pull the roughness maybe off normal or ambient occlusion. So one trick I'll do sometimes is I'll use this RGBA split, and I'll plug this in. Now, when we split this, because the normal map is RGB data that represents our XYZ RGB, so if we look at basically our B, that's going to be our Z depth pass, basically. And so this is almost like we're looking at the surface top down. So this could almost work as maybe close to like an ambient occlusion here. But what I'll do sometimes is take this, I'll do an invert grayscale on the B and get something like this. And then what I could do is I'll use my histogram range node here. So here's histogram range. And I'll pull the range all the way up to 1, and then I'll start to adjust this position value. So I want this to go up pretty high. So now you can see that I am having a little bit of variance here in my roughness where these edges are going to be more rough and these cracks are going to be more rough. And then the surface here might be a little bit more smooth. So this could be one way to work with my roughness. So I come back over to my base material, I enable that roughness input, and then plug my roughness into here. And so here's what I have. And then, of course, now I've got this nice position slider that lets me kind of go in and change, you know, the amount of this roughness here. So that's one way that I can work, and sometimes I do that. Now, like I said, what's cool is that I'm, you know, I've done so much work to create these details that describe my surface, the normal map, which has, you know, an effect on the lighting. And so since the roughness describes the microsurface, I'm using those details as well. But I'm using it based on this kind of Z axis, which is the B channel here for the RGB. So that's one method that I'll use sometimes. Another method is just to use our ambient occlusion. So if I start to do ambient occlusion here, and we want to pull this from our height, so we'll grab our height, and I just pull this guy into here. So here's our ambient occlusion. And then what I'll do is something similar. We could do invert grayscale. Let's do this. And here, I'm just going to copy and paste this histogram scan so we can have two versions. So now we've got like two versions. You can see they're pretty close to each other. One thing, the occlusion. So here in this area, in that crack, the occlusion's really filling that in for me a little nicer. So sometimes I'll do that. Again, we kind of get something that's, you know, not as uniform. We get a little variation in the cracks and kind of the nooks and cranny areas, which is good. If we wanted to, kind of, stylize this up even more, we could maybe go in and grab like a grunge map. I'm just going to grab one of these guys. I don't know, maybe 13. And let's blend. So we'll blend this guy into here, and whoops. I like to do it after the histogram range, because the histogram range is going to give me my little controller. So I'll get this, and then we'll just, we could multiply it, or even do like a max lighten here, just to combine the two, and then just look at my overall kind of contrast, lower the contrast down, adjust my balance, something like this, I don't know. Then come in and maybe adjust the overall opacity. Now I run that through the histogram range, and now I get just a little bit of detail in here, but now this histogram range acts like a global control for everything, that I really like this. Yeah, one question that just came in here, it says, isn't white for roughness equals shiny? Actually, that's kind of the reverse. So with roughness, white means rough and black means shiny. So what you're referring to there is a gloss map. So it's just the invert. So with a glossiness map, white would equal shiny and black would equal rough. So two different ways to kind of work with this. More times than not, I will say that I create this detail from the ambient occlusion. And again, I can do that because I spent so much time when I do any material. I spend so much of the effort in creating this height map. And like I said, once you do that, all your data is there. All right. And then, like I said, we get this nice little position slider here to adjust the overall roughness value. So we'll do this just to give it a little bit of variance. Now you can see that might be too much, of roughness information. I don't know. It depends on how stylized we want to go. All right, so now we've got that. Let's just delete. You know what? I'll leave it in case you guys want to see it, because I'm gonna, I'm gonna reshare this this scene in that Dropbox link. So let's just put these guys here. All right. So now we've got this guy, and we do have some ambient occlusion, which is nice. So let's just integrate that in. So let's come over here to our ambient occlusion. We'll enable that input and just place it into here. And so now we've got our ambient occlusion. So here's what this looks like. All right, cool. So that is taking care of like our map extraction phase. So the next thing we want to do, and I think I may have done something similar here with this. I'm not really sure. Like I said, I'm just going to kind of do this a different way. All right, so the next thing we want to do is work on our color. So for the color, how we're going to do this is we're just going to use a gradient map. So I'm going to come into here and grab a gradient. Now here we have this gradient. So if, I'm sorry, we have this height. And so I'm just going to plug this right here into my gradient. Now what we can do here with our gradient is click the gradient editor button. And now we have our gradient. And whenever we start to, click to add these keys in here, basically what we're doing here is we're just remapping this grayscale range from black to white. So in this map here, it goes from black to white. We're just going to remap these with certain values. So this is where you really get into maybe the swatches or the color style that you created. So it might be like on a stylized art, you might have like a 2-tone or a 3-tone. So let's say that here we had like some kind of like color palette, like maybe like a dark here, and then here in the mid-range, we're going to go more up to something like this. And then in the high range, we might try to... I don't know, maybe this is like just our color palette here. So you can see that I have something really simple. So like this 3 color zone difference here. And it just depends on the artwork. But that's just going to colorize things for me. So then on a simple level, what we could do is just come over here to our base color and just plug this guy into here. And so this could be the start of what our stone is going to look like. So now, of course, we want to come into our gradient editor and just start to tweak this. So it may be something where I need to like pull this key down here a bit. Try to tweak some of these key values. But again, like I say, it helps to think about this gradient. And like I said, it's just remapping, from black to white. And so the more detail that you feed into this map here, the more detail you're going to get basically on your stones here. So one of the things that I'll typically do, and you can see I kind of did it here, was I used a couple grunge maps here. So one of the things, which one did I do? 13? All right, so we'll grab grunge map 13 here. Play around with the contrast a little bit, and then we're going to blend it in let's see, here and here, and I think I'll do like a multiply, and then adjust my opacity. Sorry. Okay, so another question that just came in here, the base color with all the outputs, is that from the program or did you make it? This guy here, this base material, this actually ships with Designer. I actually did make this. Very happy to say. It was very cool to have like a little contribution to Substance Designer. It was so cool. So that was fun to make something. But yeah, I actually made it myself, but we did integrate it. So here underneath PBR, I'm sorry, where is it? Filters, nope, material filters, is it? Yeah, PBR utilities, you'll find it here. So it's in base material. And then, so that's what this guy is here. And I made it because it was just a mimic of the workflow that I use. I was constantly doing this. You'll notice that I'm not going back and forth to all these outputs constantly, moving around my graph like this. I'm just working right off this centralized node. I love this workflow because then I can also do things like really quick. Like what if I wanted to say like, oh, you know what, I want to change the roughness, but I don't want to make any reconnections. Let's say I wanted to use this grunge map and do a quick test. So I can just right click, drag and drop, and then replace that roughness input to the shader. And now it changes it. So if I zoom in, you can see I can just get a quick idea of what that does. And I can be like, okay, that was a good little test. And now I'll just drag and drop this guy back in to go back. So I like to work this way because you can see that I keep my nodes kind of central to this. And I'm just, working kind of in this local section of my graph. And then I can just drag and drop stuff into the 3D view to overwrite channels whenever I need to. So the other question here, so it updates without reconnect. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. If you could just add a little bit more detail on that. I'm sorry, I might just be a little confused on what you mean there with the update without reconnect. Do you mean like reconnect to the outputs? Because like I don't see these outputs unless I do a view outputs in 3D view. So let's say I did that, view outputs in 3D view. You can see I'm getting a totally different result right now. But you can replace anything in the shader. So like when I right click and drag something in, it gives me a pop-up, and I could tell that map to replace any of these channel inputs. Or since we're working with a material, so here in our graph, you can see that you have this material mode. If I set to compact to material, all these channels, they compile down into like a material. So what I'm doing here is, since I have all these channels, if I drag this entire node in, it knows where to place all those. So it just resets the shader to whatever I drag into it. So it's just a fast way to work, really. And so, like I said, this part right here is where it just takes a lot of time, where you're going to kind of play around with stuff. So here, like I said, we just made a little bit of some little bit of variation to that. Let's plug that into the gradient map. And now with the gradient map, we're going to have maybe a little bit more value here to work with. So maybe I'll do this. Just kind of playing around with like maybe trying to do like a color palette here. Oops, don't like that. Okay, so anyways, just kind of playing around. There we go. Takes me a long time to get the colors, because I just mess around with them for so long. So hold on, just bear with me. I'm just kind of making this one up as I go. Another thing that you can do, of course, that I do often, I'm sorry, let me just play with it a little bit more. I don't like that. Yeah, let's do something like this, I guess. It helps, like, if you actually have, like, a color palette system, or I'm sorry, like something already picked. I didn't in this case. Okay, let's see. Come on here. Let's come up with something. So what I like to do, like especially here, like in the shadows, is do something like a totally contrasting color. So we'll get like a blue in here, and then we'll try something like maybe, I don't know. Sorry. Yeah, let's do something like this, I guess. All right, that's kind of cool. Sorry, I could just mess with these colors forever. All right, so let's just say something like this. There we go. I'm doing it again. Okay, there. So there's one range. And one of the things that you may have seen before is that how you can use this pick gradient. So say I have something that's like a color palette. Let me try something real quick. So here I just have a web browser open. And I'm just going to try something. Oh, okay. Let's try this. Okay, so let me show you here. So on the screen, hopefully you can see here, I just picked just some colors here. So this is just something that's sitting up on my web page. And so I'll just move that off the screen. And then what I can do is I can just come over and click this pick gradient, and then I could just drag across a couple of these values. So here I'll just do something like this. And then here you can see that it regenerates my keys here. So it's just like if you already have something picked, you could just do this, and you can see that it's already kind of picking colors for you just by running this across this value here. So it's pretty cool. So there, we could do something like that. And then let me try this. Invert the positions. So we can kind of invert them and so on. So yeah, it's pretty interesting that we can do things like that. That's a little sample here. Ooh, that's terrible. Let's see, invert positions. Don't like it. All right, so I'm just going to undo just a little bit. But anyways, I'll use that pick gradient tool a lot to do some things like that. So just kind of undoing this here. All right, we'll just kind of go back to this for now. Okay, so anyways, that's how the pick gradient works and how we can use that to our advantage. So then, we'll get something like this. I'm sorry, it's a terrible color pick, but, I'll just keep moving forward. So this right here, like I said, gives me my full material. So something else that I'm going to do beyond that is I want to start thinking about my edges. So here, another thing that I did was I come into this curvature node, and it depends. We've got two versions of that. You'll notice that we have curvature and curvature smooth. Whoops, already had that connected. Sorry, let me kill that guy. So we have curvature, and let's add the curvature smooth. And I want to show you the difference between these two guys. So let's zoom into here. The curvature node takes your normal, so we'll grab the normal and we'll plug it in. And we'll view this guy. So what it does is it just puts, we can increase the intensity here, and you can see that it just puts this kind of white edge on all of the, this white around all of the edge areas. And so we can use this here to kind of do like a highlight to our brick. Curvature smooth. Here's a tip as well in case you didn't know this. See how this is already connecting this output? Instead of like moving my mouse up and grabbing this guy and then trying to move my mouse down and connecting it, one thing I could do is hold down the control key and left click right on this output, the input, and then just borrow the connection, and then just left click to remove it. So now if you look at curvature smooth, you can see it produces, well, a more smooth result. And this may be more of what I want to work with. So then I think what I might do is just run a levels here and just play around with this levels. Maybe try something like this. Okay, so now we have this levels here. This is a grayscale map, so I'm going to end up using this guy with my color. So let's grab these two nodes and just move them up here so we can kind of see what we're doing. So in order for me to blend these two guys together, we've got two different data types. We've got gray and color. So we need to convert this to color. And to do that, you just use a gradient map. And if you just use a gradient map and don't set any keys, you can see it didn't change anything, but it just converted it to color. So we'll plug these two guys together here, and then I could try something like maybe an overlay. Whoops, no, let's try just some different modes here. So yeah, let's, instead of add, maybe I'll try a screen. Let's do a screen. So now you can see here in my base color, we start to get kind of this white kind of edging, that's kind of like the worn areas of the stone. And then we will plug this here into our base color. So now here's the result that we're getting. Something like this here. If I were to have tried to do that here with this guy, just out of curiosity, let's see what it would do. So instead of using curvature smooth, let's use the regular curvature. Yeah, it's not really strong enough. It's not doing what I want. So there we go. And then, of course, maybe I'll go back here to my levels and just make a tweak or two. Something like this. Okay, that's working for me. All right, so just to kind of show you something else that I've done here, you can see that when I worked the color before, I did the same thing where I had like a little bit of a noise. And then here I've got, this time I also multiplied my ambient occlusion in. I'll do that as well in just a second. But here you can see I did the same thing with my gradient where I just picked a bunch of ranges of values. I actually just sampled that off of an image of stone, using that the pick gradient tool. So that's where I got those values. But everything else is the same. So what I'm going to do at this stage is just delete all of this stuff. Whoops. Let's just delete all that. Okay. Okay, so then like I said, I also have this ambient occlusion. So again, since kind of a stylized trick, another thing we could do, let's add another gradient map so we can take this these gray values from our ambient occlusion and we can convert that to color. And then we will blend that here and we'll multiply it on. So now here's what we're getting. So here was the opacity all the way down. We're just multiplying in. And what I can do now is I can go in. Whoops, here. Let's double click to view this color map. Let's go back to our gradient. And here again is where we can get kind of more stylized with the coloring. So like for the black values, if I want to, I could make this, like if I wanted to make it like a red or some kind of tint, I could do that. So this is like kind of on the edging. So let's do something like, maybe like a blue like this. Whoops. So here's what we had, and then here it is with our occlusion. There we go. All right, so just a little tweak there. Again, just kind of getting some of that ambient occlusion into the diffuse color. So now we'll put that down. And then, of course, we can go back to our ambient occlusion and adjust things like our height depth and things like that. So we might want to make a slight change to that. And then if that's looking a bit too smooth, let's get rid of that curvature here. If that's looking a bit too smooth, of course, we can go over here to our histogram and increase our roughness or decrease it if we need to. That's way too gloss. We don't want that. But we could do something like this here. And so here you can see that, well, we now have our brick wall, but it has this stylized kind of look to it here. Also, if I want to go back over here to my normal, let's try to setting this to something a little bit higher, like 40. And I think it's too glossy, so let me come back over to my roughness and just increase that. There we go. All right, so that is right at an hour, and that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover here. So you can see we're using the same techniques. It's just, just trying to work with them a little bit differently. This becomes the kind of the base color that I look at. It almost kind of has like a little bit of like a hand-drawn type look to it if you look at it up close. You can see our shapes and everything. And of course, I'm kind of running through this quickly. We could, work a little bit better on it and such to get more, maybe a little more variation and so on. But you can see that, coming up with some kind of like stylized texture like this is actually pretty simple, I think. We have all the benefits of PBR giving us these consistent values that we can work with, but, really it just comes down to maybe not, going so crazy with the detail, meaning that like when we're working on our height map, we want to kind of limit how much we're going to do in terms of, microsurface detail, and that really translates more to the roughness. So again, like on a stylized asset like this, we're not really going to use so much of roughness. And like I said, the more detail and everything, the more realistic it looks. But we could really probably get away with just a uniform value for our roughness map. We did a little bit of tweaking to it, but again, we can always change that if we need to. So then once we have everything, you can see that, well, I created this substance here with these outputs when I did file new substance in the template. So I have my outputs here. If I just hit 3 on the keyboard, that takes me into my compact material mode, and then I can just drag the single output and it connects everything for me. Another thing we can do, let's just say that we created it blank and we didn't have any outputs. I do this a lot. When I start a substance, I just say empty, and I don't even worry about the outputs because I'm working this way. And now instead of creating the outputs individually, a trick is you can right click this node and you can say create output nodes, and then it says create nodes for hidden connectors. I'm going to say no because I do have like spec gloss outputs to this which are off, so I'm going to say no, and it does. It just connects here my base color, normal, roughness, metal. We didn't have a metal, so it's going to be black, ambient occlusion, and all that kind of stuff. Here's our height. Now, our height, you can see, is just gray. And like I said, we did have a height map. And so in our case, we just didn't add it. So let's do this. Let's come over and enable our height. So now we have our height channel. And let's grab hold of, where is this guy? Here he is. Here's our height. I don't want to use this one because this one has some detail in it. This one was specifically just for getting some variation in that coloring. This is the one I would probably want to use. But sometimes with height for parallax, what I'll do is, whoops, not a blend. I just do a blur on it. So let's do a blur high quality. Let's plug it into here and just decrease it. Let's do something like that. So I just kind of blur those details a little bit because, like I say, the blur is always kind of going to be, the height is going to be like our kind of our silhouette shape. If we're using displacement or if we're using, parallax occlusion. And then our normal map is where we're going to have a lot of that intricate detail. So we'll place that in. Now, of course, since that was in, well, wait, it should work now, right? Yep, there we go. So there's our height. Now, one other thing I want to show you guys. So you'll notice that I have this height, but then when I look at this, I've got this height. It's like, wait a minute, why is the value different? So if you go over to this base, you'll notice that we have height and we have height range. And I think what I need to do is just pull this up to, whoops, no, 1. So say the height range is at 1, so it's using the full range of what I input to it. So you just might want to be, careful about how that can change your height. So that's going to take care of this entire substance here on how we created this. And like I said, I'm going to reshare this. I did have a Dropbox link at the beginning, but I'm going to send this new one here. So Charles will do a recap email, and he'll send the Dropbox link. From here on out, I'm going to start adding everything to this Dropbox link so that you guys can just have access to everything. So that's going to conclude this webinar, and I want to thank everyone for showing up, and I thank you very much for your time. As always, if you have any suggestions, please just drop either myself or Charles an email and let us know of any type of topics that you guys would like to see discussed in these webinars. Always would like to hear from you. And so everybody enjoy your upcoming weekend, and I will see you next month for the next education webinar.